Welcome to the Tackling College Sports Podcast, the definitive resource to help you navigate your way to play college-level sports. Here are your hosts, Chris Legates and Mark Franco, where they want you, the TCS Nation, to be your best.
Welcome, TCS Nation, and thanks for tuning in to the Tackling College Sports Podcast, session number 6. I'm your co-host, Mark Franco, and alongside me is the Sundance Kid, Chris Legates. Today, Chris and I have the pleasure of interviewing Brian Reynolds, strength and conditioning coach and owner of Thunder Sports and Fitness. Today, Brian will speak about his big message: talent only gets you so far, and strength and conditioning from the neck up. Sit back, grab your dumbbells, and have a listen. Hey, Brian, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, guys. Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Hey, could you take our listeners through your days in Cape May to your current venture at Thunder Sports and Fitness?
Yeah, sure. So I was always very active growing up. Baseball was really my primary sport. I actually moved to Cape May, New Jersey, when I was about 16, and ended up making the team down there. It was a very frightening time for me because I was kind of uprooted right in the middle of high school, and didn't know what the climate was going to be down there with the sports. But I was good enough to make that team and played a couple of years. Graduated from Cape May, or from Middle Township High School down in Cape May County. And then came right back up to Connecticut, where I played a couple of years of baseball at Eastern Connecticut State University. Mm-hmm. And kind of when I started college, I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I just knew that I was into sports, and really all I knew was physical education to be kind of the primary major that I would get involved in. So I started as a phys ed major, and after a couple years, just became very interested in strength and conditioning. I ended up switching my major to sports and recreation management with a focus on health and fitness, and just really started working towards becoming a strength coach. I really don't know where it came from. I just knew early on that I was interested in fitness and the development of human performance, and kind of just went down that route and haven't looked back. So I ended up graduating college in 2005 from Eastern. Shortly after that, obtained my CSCS, which is Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist certification through the National Strength and Conditioning Organization. And just shortly after that, started working with youth athletes at an organization here in Connecticut. Got some great hands-on experience. Was able to work with the Connecticut Giants. I don't know if anybody remembers this team, but several years ago, we had a semi-pro football team in Connecticut, and really it solidified my passion for strength and conditioning, and I knew even more so that that's kind of what I wanted to spend the rest of my life kind of aiming for and doing. Unfortunately, a little while after starting that job in Connecticut in the strength and conditioning field, I realized how challenging, how competitive, and also how limiting the job opportunities were, maybe not just in Connecticut, but all over the country. And I ended up leaving that job for a full-time job with a YMCA in Waterbury, where my job responsibilities just completely did a 180-degree turn. Now I was sitting behind a desk a lot, managing employees, doing payroll type things, and
something I assume you didn't want to do, or?
Yeah, well, I guess I didn't really have a lot of experience. The full-time job seemed nice. It was a nice little carrot dangling in front of my face at the time. I didn't really know anything other than I needed to kind of make more money if I wanted to continue to eat and stay in my apartment. So I kind of left and pursued that, and actually got a chance to work with Ryan Gomes for a little while on a limited basis while I was there. And after 2 or 3 years, I'm like, this is not what I want to do. So I needed to get back into strength and conditioning, and just so happened I was in the right place at the right time. We had an intern at the YMCA who was an athlete at Southern, and I just ended up hearing through the grapevine that the strength and conditioning position was going to open at SCSU, Southern Connecticut State University. And I placed a few phone calls. Before you know it, I got an interview, and 2-3 weeks after that, I was the strength coach at Southern Connecticut State, which is kind of great for me. I mean, it's all about who you get that piece of information from, and then if you act upon it at the right time, that's really how things work out. And I'm really glad it did work out. So I spent 4 years at Southern Connecticut State University on a part-time basis. I was working with 11 intercollegiate athletic programs in 2012. By the time I was there 4 years, and it was a great experience. Unfortunately, it was a part-time position, and again, reality struck in. I was about to have my second child, and we had a house at the time. My wife was in business for herself, and unfortunately, I had to leave and kind of make another decision financially. So I ended up doing that. I got my master's degree in the process of being a strength coach at Southern. The plan was to try to get a position in Division I or professional sports. And I applied at several places: Yale, Quinnipiac, Central Connecticut, Sacred Heart University here in Connecticut. But the harsh reality is, in the strength and conditioning fields, unless you're willing to kind of uproot and move somewhere, you're really limiting yourself. So after about a year and a half of kind of struggling through that and not knowing the right people and not being in the right place at the right time, I started my own business. It's called Thunder Sports and Fitness. And now I'm kind of dedicating my life to providing these strength and conditioning, providing the strength and conditioning information to high school athletes and college coaches who unfortunately don't have strength and conditioning coaches at their disposal, because that's probably the biggest lesson I've learned in my time in this profession, is that there aren't a lot of opportunities for strength coaches. And unfortunately, that kind of trickles down to the high school athlete who, in my opinion, are the athletes that need these services the most. And I've seen a lot of them come into college with absolutely no skills in the weight room, and I think they could get a lot more out of their high school sports endeavors, and then also get a lot more out of the recruiting process if they are a lot more prepared. So that's kind of where I'm at right now with my career.
Got it. Excellent. Hey, Chris will take the next question.
Hey, Brian, good morning, and thank you for joining us on the Tackling College Sports podcast. One of the questions we deal with a lot, and I'm a former college coach, and I run a premier club program in soccer out of Cheshire, Connecticut. A lot of the questions parents will come to us and ask is, when should student athletes begin regular workouts with trainers, strength and conditioning people, or even on their own? What ages and what do you advise is the best place for a student athlete to begin their training regimen?
That's a great question, and there's definitely a ton of controversy around when a youth athlete should start getting involved in strength training and conditioning. There's actually an individual in my field. His name's Avery Fagenbaum, and I got a chance to see him speak several years back. And he's really, he's the aficionado on youth strength training. And I kind of picked up on everything that he talks about in the lectures that he gives and in the papers that he writes. And he believes, and I believe as well, that as soon as an athlete is ready to participate in organized sports, which in this country is about 7 to 8 years old, they're typically ready to start some type of resistance training or neuromuscular training. Now, there's a lot of preparation. Obviously they need good instruction and safety. They need to know, what are sensible starting weights, repetitions, jump heights, and proper handling of the equipment, proper spotting techniques, if that's applicable. So they really need a lot of instruction. So the answer to the question is they can start early. Obviously, I would recommend they work with a trainer because, kids these days are involved in multiple sports. Adding something like strength and conditioning is just another piece of the puzzle, and all those things kind of need to mesh together. And they all need to be taken into consideration in that athlete's total workload for the week. But all in all, the research on youth strength and conditioning is astonishing. There's a lot of evidence in support of it. Just one case, for example, I read a study in female athletes that were very young, 12 years old. the ones that were self-reporting that they participated in resistance training actually had a 13.4% improvement in lower extremity control, where their counterparts who did not report any strength training and conditioning, by the time they were 12 and when they retested them when they were 14, they had a 21.7% reduction in lower extremity control. So there's definitely evidence out there that supports youth strength training. Again, it's very important that it's done under the right considerations, it's done under the right coaching, and then it's got to be part of the big picture. It can't be something that's thought of as separate from sports participation. There's got to be structure to it, and there's got to be obviously rest periods that are kind of implemented in conjunction with all of this, all the things, all the initiatives.
How young are some of the athletes you're working with now, Brian?
When I was first starting my career, I did work with very young athletes, 8, 9, 10 years old. We also had some pretty elite level athletes as well at the facility I worked at. But I would say over the past 5 years, I've worked primarily with college athletes. Of course, I had the position at Southern Connecticut State. I currently work with a couple pretty elite level athletes. One is on a pretty professional, well, approaching pretty professional rugby status. He's working with the Northeast Olympic Development Academy. And then I also work with an arena football player. I just kind of program for him and send him the materials. But my experience with youth level athletes, 7 to 8 years old, very limited. That's why I kind of defer and kind of read the Avery Feigenbaum advice before I try to comment on things like that. But definitely from, the majority of my experiences with college athletes, high school athletes, and more elite level athletes.
And you just mentioned that you worked at Southern Connecticut State and that you've worked with rugby athletes and obviously football players. We share a common friend in Adam Cohen, and you've worked with his soccer program at Southern. What are the challenges of training athletes that are in different sports, Brian? What really is the thing that you find is, okay, I have to set goals, but their goals are different in sports that are, let's say, aerobic versus anaerobic or, fast muscle twitch kind of things. What are you finding to be the biggest challenges in training different athletes in different sports?
I think this is probably as good as time as any to kind of discuss the sport specificity theory. And, I definitely believe in sport specificity. I will preface this comment by saying, there are a lot more similarities in sports than there are differences. For example, athletes in the majority of sports that we're going to talk about, they need rotational power. They need to be able to rotate. They need to be able to kind of decelerate, plant, and push off. They need to change direction. They need strength. Regardless if it's an anaerobic or aerobic sport, there's always going to be a combination of those two variables, working together, regardless of the sport you're in, unless of course maybe you throw a shot put. That's probably the only thing I can think about. But there's always going to be these things coming into play. So I want to just say that there's not a specific drill or set of drills that are going to be exclusive to any sport. There's going to be some crossover, and I think that's an important thing to realize. I would say one of the biggest challenges or one of the biggest differences, and this is kind of digging a little deeper into sports specificity, is the training timeline, or the length of the season, the number of games per week that an athlete is going to be competing in, the number of training sessions per week.
Right.
So it's really about the timeline, and it's about, I would say, the work to rest ratio of the sport is going to come into play as well. And these are really the things that make sports specificity, in my mind, what it is. It's so we have to take that timeline, especially if we're talking about in-season training, and we have to manage our peaks and our unloading periods when we talk about strength training, because we obviously need that athlete to perform at their best when the game time comes, but more importantly when the playoffs come or when tournament time comes. That's really when we need to get our athletes to peak. So the timeline, I would say, is probably one of the biggest challenges, because it's very different based on the sport that you're working with. I'm also going to kind of talk about the personalities. I think when I was at Southern, and I kind of alluded to this earlier when I was talking about getting everyone on board and taking the initiatives and looking at them more of a big picture instead of, single initiatives. When you're working in a strength and conditioning staff, and I had 11 teams, that's up to 22 or 25 coaches that I was working with and trying to coordinate my efforts with. And I have my goals and they have their goals. The biggest challenge is trying to coordinate all of our goals so that they're complementing each other, and ultimately that is really what is going to make the difference in the season, I think, is if everyone's on the same page.
And obviously the NCAA has scheduling restrictions and things of that nature that make your job even a little bit harder, because a sport like soccer, let's say, is really kind of compact and condensed into maybe a 3-month season. The dates of competition where you can do heavy lifts or heavy workouts in preparation for the next competition may only be 3 and 4 days in advance, correct?
That is correct. And, they often play multiple times per week, and soccer is a sport that you can't recover from quickly. It's at minimum 90 minutes. And then, there was one year when I was at Southern, for some reason, we had about 5 games on the schedule where we went double overtime. I mean, so again, you make a plan, and you kind of have to adjust it based on what's happening in reality. And that's the challenge, being able to get everyone coordinated enough and in agreement on those initiatives together.
Mark?
Hey, Brian, you just mentioned length of season. And, it seems nowadays that most sports, I think of it personally, my eldest daughter plays high school soccer, and the season seems to be year round, plays at the club level, and that's winter and spring. Can you speak to the if you've seen an increase in injuries due to overtraining or length of season?
Yeah, sure. I'm certainly not an expert in this area. I did look into some things yesterday. I found a 2008 National Council of Youth Sports survey indicates that 60 million children between 6 and 18 years of age participate in organized sports. And then of that, almost 75% participate in more than one sport. So that's kind of staggering to look at that. And
wow.
And I think that that's great. I think that there are definitely pros and cons to both sport specialization, but also non-specialization. If you look at specialization, where your athlete, participates in one sport and they have a traditional off season, there's obviously more control over the outcome of their training. But on the flip side of that, there's, they lack the experience of participating in these other sports and meeting other kids and kind of determining if there may be a different avenue they want to head down in the future. When you look at non-sport specialization, the kids that participate in 2-3 sports and don't have a traditional off season and are kind of go all year round, they gain the experience and the growth of being involved in all these things, but there's a great lack of control over the outcome of their training. You can't control the fact that they may have a game on Monday and then another game on Wednesday for another team, and maybe they're playing 3 or 4 days during the week and then practicing another 2 days, and you really can't control that. And there's a lot of different coaches involved, and then if you add strength and conditioning to that, I mean, you really have a whole pile of things that could potentially lead to these overuse injuries if everyone's not on board with the initiatives and it's not kind of a consolidated effort like I talked about previously.
Sure. And
so
go ahead.
So the research really indicates that the volume, there's a couple things that contribute to these overuse injuries. One, is the athlete prepared? Are they heading into their next season? Say I'm a baseball player and I want to play competitive basketball over the summer. Did I recover enough before the transition into that next season where I can realistically say I'm going onto the court at 100%? Am I physically and mentally ready for the demands of the sport? And then secondly, it's really comes down to the volume of training. And an interesting statistic athletes that were involved in greater than 16 hours per week of training or competition had a severely increased risk of injury and hospitalizations because of the sheer volume of training that they were required to perform.
Okay, this leads me right into my next question, which is the importance of rest. And if you wouldn't mind elaborating, perhaps based on the age group and perhaps sports specificity as well.
Sure. Yeah, rest it's very important, and a lot of times it's overlooked. But when we're talking about strength and conditioning, and I'll even talk about sports, but I can talk more about strength training. It's really an integral part of our schedule. I mean, when we make an annual strength training program for an athlete, there are periods of unload in there where our training volume reduces, the intensity reduces. We actually take an entire week and dedicate it just to reduce volume and intensity training to let the athlete recover. We need to let their nervous system recover, their hormonal system. We need to allow the changes and the remodeling of the tissue to actually take place before we expect the gains to come. So, I mean, it's an integral part of what we do as strength and conditioning professionals, and it really can't be underestimated, because it's really going to determine your ability to rest and recover is really going to determine the outcome of your training program, especially when you talk about power and speed and agility development. Those are all nervous system adaptations, and I'm telling you right now that you're not going to experience favorable adaptations in speed and agility if you're not recovering properly.
Sure. Are there any, from your knowledge, are there any sports in particular where this is more important perhaps than others?
The human physiology is what it is. I mean, obviously, I think it's more difficult to recover in sports that have very high frequency of training. Like we talked about the soccer schedule, they try to condense all these games into a very short period of time. Soccer is extremely intense and an extremely volatile sport, and giving an athlete 2 days to recover in between matches is a little bit unrealistic. So, and then on the flip side of that, you have football, which competes one time a week. I mean, the sport is very high intensity and there's a lot of contact. But it would be very unrealistic, I think, to ask a football player to play 2 games in a week.
Sure.
And so I think the main thing here is the frequency of competition or the frequency of training. Those are the sports that I think are at higher risk for injury and kind of need a really detailed plan of rest around those sports to get the best out of the athletes and keep them healthy and keep them below that threshold of overtraining. Because if you have an athlete that's overtraining in season, you have a big problem on your hands, especially if they're a big part of your success.
Right. Great information. Chris?
Yeah, I was going to say that's a great message, Brian, and it segues into my next question as well, which is, what are some of the common injuries that you're now seeing, and do you see a correlation based upon the sport? And in addition to that, and as a piggyback question, what would, let's say, a strength and conditioning coach or let's say a coach of a sport doing for prevention of those injuries in their training?
Yeah, sure. From my experience at Southern Connecticut State, my job was to prevent these injuries from occurring. But if there's one thing you can count on, you can definitely count on the fact that regardless of how hard you work on that initiative, somebody's going to get injured. I mean, if we talk about football, again, for an example, it's a high contact sport, and hockey's the same way, lacrosse is the same way. I mean, I can do all that I can in my power, but I'm not going to prevent somebody from getting landed on the field, and spraining their ankle or twisting their knee or getting a severe contusion to their quad because they took a helmet on it. So just to start, I mean, that's probably the major issues that I would see with a football athlete. are these real severe contusions, and they can be, you may think of a contusion as something benign, and wonder why an athlete needs to miss time over that. But if you hit a contusion several times, it actually turns into something pretty severe. So contusions in football, sprained ankles in football, I would say lower body muscle strains in all sports. I really don't think any sport is kind of not included under that umbrella of sports injury. Obviously, in basketball, taping is a big deal, which, I mean, I kind of go off on a little different direction here. But in basketball, sprained ankles is quite a big deal, so they tape quite a bit. And then by chronically taping their ankles, they actually start to give themselves knee problems. So I would say ankle problems, knee problems, big time in basketball. Rotator cuff injuries, tendinitis in any overhead throwing athletes, swimming, volleyball, baseball. We typically see quite a few shoulder. I wouldn't say injuries. I mean, I see tendinitis more often in these athletes than actual injuries. And tendinitis is, let me rephrase that. Tendinitis is an overuse injury. A rotator cuff strain or a tear is kind of an acute, longer lasting injury. So tendinitis is 100% preventable through primarily preparing properly and then also training volume. So you see a lot of these injuries in swimming, volleyball, baseball.
Right. And in the college level, and actually now with Thundersport Fitness, you're getting athletes who are maybe rehabbing or coming back from injuries. What's the role of the strength and conditioning coach in the rehabilitation process?
Well, the athlete would need to be cleared by a physician to come back into strength and conditioning 100%. But strength and conditioning professionals definitely need to work with the athletic training staff to get the athlete doing things with the non-affected parts of the body. And that's kind of what I prided myself in when I was working at Southern, is getting the athletes out of the training room, because they're really just working on the injury in the training room. They need to come into the strength training facility and work the parts of the body that are not affected. There's actually a lot of research that supports this cross-education theory, where if an athlete has an injured left hip and I take them into the weight room and I do a lot of focused strength training and power training with the right hip, there's going to be a very reduced loss of strength in that left hip while it's recovering. So the athlete should continue to do something while they're recovering from an injury. They just need professional advice and guidance to keep them on the right track and make sure they're not making that injury any more severe than it is.
That's excellent. Mark.
Okay, Brian, this is the part of the podcast where we ask these questions of every guest. Next to are more personal questions, if you will. Do you have a favorite quote that you can share?
Yeah, I'm definitely not as big on the quotes as Sam Lopes is, but
I don't think anybody is.
No, but I do have a few. One of them, I don't really know where this comes from. I just know that I saw it in a facility a long time ago. The will to prepare to win is just as important as the will to win itself. So that's really important for me, because that's exactly what I do. I prepare athletes to win, whether they think so or not. I mean, I'm sure a lot of athletes think they come into the weight room, they think my objective is to just put them in as much pain and discomfort as possible through the training methods. But we're actually, there's a big picture. We're trying to build that foundation so they are fit enough to enter the season and have a high level of fitness that we can maintain until they reach the playoffs or championship time.
Sure. Good quote.
And I do have a few others. I'm kind of big on these inspirational quotes, and the quotes that kind of lead to feeling this sense that you control your own destiny. And John F. Kennedy had one that said, "Things do not happen; things are made to happen." And I truly believe that. And it's kind of like what I'm going through in my life, personally and professionally right now. I mean, there's a lot of times where I could have given up on strength and conditioning. Since Southern Connecticut State University, it's really been quite a difficult path for me. So I try to stay positive by looking at these quotes and,
Sure.
and reading one of my favorite books, which I know you want to ask me about.
That's the next question. Go right ahead.
Yeah, but again, one of my favorite books is Unlimited Power by Tony Robbins.
Yeah, I've read that. It's a good book.
Yep.
I ended up reading it several years ago, and it's just one of those books that I go back to and kind of read pieces of it occasionally, just to keep myself thinking positively and on the right track. Somebody asked me a while back, if you could have one superpower, what would that be? And I thought about it for a second, and I probably would have answered this very differently 10 years ago, but I thought about it now in this time I'm going through, and I said, listen, if I could have the superpower of never having a negative thought, I think that would serve me very well, and probably a lot of other people as well.
I like that.
That's
That's a good
awesome.
one.
That's awesome.
Chris, go ahead.
Brian, what would you say is a great piece of training advice for students and parents? What would you tell them as they begin the process and the journey of your training or strength and conditioning training?
Yeah, I would definitely say, listen, and this is something I was very bad at when I was coming up as an athlete, but the first piece of advice is listen to your body and be its voice, because it's something I didn't get to talk about when we were talking about the injuries too. It's hard to know how many kids are actually injured because of overuse, because there's a lot of them that aren't going to report it. And I think about when I was playing sports, honestly, I was chronically injured. Playing baseball, I had elbow tendonitis. I slid one time and banged my knee up and just kept playing on it and ended up making it worse. But, going back, I would probably do things a little bit differently, and that's my advice, is to listen to the body and just realize that there's a big difference between being uncomfortable because you're training or practicing and being hurt or injured. And I think athletes need to know the difference between those and then speak up when something like that happens. In addition to that, I think parents and athletes should start thinking about strength training and conditioning in a very structured way a little bit earlier than they are currently, and definitely a lot earlier than I thought about it when I was a college athlete. So like I said before, kids as young as 7 and 8 years old can start doing something. They're not going to go into the weight room and do complicated Olympic lifts, but basic things like single leg balance exercises, things that are going to fire up the nervous system and start to train the neuromuscular, the nervous system to be more athletic. These are things that they can do now and are going to make a big difference on their athleticism later in life. So, start developing these things early. Seek out coaches and professionals that have credentials, that have experience in the field, and also can provide testimony to the skills that they have. There's a lot of people in the field of strength and conditioning. You can go online right now and pick out of a hat, and you're probably going to find someone that's not qualified to work with your kid. Honestly, you really have to know what you're looking for. There are several certifications in the field that are high quality. There are several institutions that people in my field have had experience at that need to be investigated before you kind of pull the trigger and sign your kid up to work with somebody. Because the fact of the matter is the fitness industry is not very tightly regulated in terms of quality control. I'll be very honest with you right now. And so you got to do your homework and kind of know who you're working with and know what their credentials are. And then the last piece of advice, and this is kind of a big message for me, and it's one of the reasons I'm really excited to be on this show, because I can kind of share a personal experience with athletes and parents, and then hopefully, try to get them to foster some beliefs a little bit earlier than I fostered them when I was kind of coming up and trying to pursue an athletic scholarship and make a position on a team. So young athletes, you've got to remember that once you get to college, everyone on the team is the cream of the crop. I'll tell you that right now. When I showed up to play baseball at Eastern Connecticut, I was expecting to start, and I sat 90% of the first year I played there on the bench.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got to get over the fact that, what you were in high school is definitely not what you're going to be in college, unless you take you take the precautionary steps to improve yourself before you get there. In order to achieve greatness, you've got to supplement your talent with targeted preparation. And I think it should start a little bit earlier than it does now, and that's kind of the goal and the mission of what I'm going to be doing in the next several years with my life and my business. But, talent's only going to get you so far, and it usually has a way of separating the great athletes from the good ones when you get to college. So that's something that I think everyone should be prepared for.
And you kind of almost jumped ahead to my next question. Is you have a great message, and the approach to everything that you're doing is really something that a lot of people should be looking into. As you speak, you almost hear a sports psychology mentality there as well. And as a strength and conditioning coach, and as a coach of almost any sport, you wear a lot of different hats. Do you employ some sports psychology into your training methodology?
I'm certainly not an expert on sports psychology. I would say the main thing that I do, and this is a very important thing, when I meet an athlete for the first time, I begin my strength and conditioning efforts from the neck up. So by showing the athlete that I care about them, first and foremost, is really the foundation of my efforts as a strength and conditioning coach. Because I can have the best program on the planet Earth, if that athlete doesn't think I know what I'm talking about, and more importantly, if they don't think that I care about their success and their goals and objectives, then they're not going to, they're not going to commit to the program. They're not going to be dedicated to it. And when they leave my supervision and go home and try to, continue on with that program, the initiatives of the summer break, they're probably just going to toss it out the window on the ride home. So I think that's probably the major way that I use sports psychology, is I start in the athlete's mind, I think, and show them that I really care. And then the other way in my field that we kind of use psychology is by showing results, and we do that through performance testing. It's really the only way that we can truly quantify if we're actually making a difference or not, is, if the athlete is improving in the performance tests that we test them on. So, when they do improve, that can be very motivational. And then on the flip side, if they don't improve, it's very detrimental. But in most cases, they'll improve.
Great. Mark.
So, Brian, as you know, this podcast and website that we have is really based around the student athlete, but we also like our technology. Chris and I use, obviously, Skype quite often, Evernote as well. Is there anything, web-based application or site that you just can't live without on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, there's probably a couple. I'd say my email is one of them. I'm kind of in a. I know this is bad, and I used to do this early in my career, but now I'm checking I'm like a vulture on my email for some reason. I know it's not the best thing to do, but I don't let an email sit in my box for more than like 10 minutes, I think, sometimes. But other than that, YouTube, I'm doing a lot of promotional things on YouTube right now, trying to, advertise my brand and also, more importantly, educate coaches that are out there and are kind of in my network right now. I use YouTube quite a bit, and I post a video up there at least once a week. And then Skype, I use Skype quite a bit to communicate with my program developer. He's actually in North Carolina, so without Skype, I guess there's probably some other application, but I definitely use Skype quite a bit. But honestly, other than work, I'm really not on the computer much doing anything personal. So I guess only the applications and websites that I kind of use for work, I don't think I could do without.
And chasing a couple kids around, I'm sure too, Brian, right?
Yeah, I certainly am.
Yeah, it's amazing that most people don't realize that YouTube is the number 2 search engine behind Google.
Yeah, I just heard that the other day.
Yeah, amazing.
That's pretty exciting, and it's a great site. I mean, I go on the YouTube Academy all the time and learn how to optimize my videos and all that stuff. It's a great site.
Yeah. Chris?
Brian, you speak of your brand, and we talk about thundersportfitness.com. Can you elaborate a little bit on its philosophy and the mission of it?
Yeah, it started about a year and a half ago. I just had this idea out of nowhere to kind of develop a website and a software program that coaches can use. Because, like I said, I had quite a difficult time breaking into the strength and conditioning industry. There are hardly any strength and conditioning coaches in public high schools and even private high schools in Connecticut. I'm sure it's the same way around the nation. Even Division III colleges, Division II colleges, like I told you, I was a part-time strength and conditioning coach at Southern Connecticut for 4 years. The turnover there is, that's kind of par for the course. A strength coach would be there for 4 years and then they'll up and leave because they can't really get a commitment there. So I kind of learned very early that there's a big gap that exists between high school and really high level college athletic programs. And the reality is that most of our athletes are not going to go to a Division I school. So my philosophy and the philosophy of Thunder Sports and Fitness is to bring the highest quality strength training and conditioning information to athletes and to coaches that are unfortunate enough to not be able to have a strength and conditioning coach, because quite frankly, that's what they all deserve. Quality strength training information should not be reserved solely for the athletes that are at that point in time the most athletic. Kids are going to develop through college. We had a kid on our football team at Southern Connecticut who, probably didn't get looked at by a Division I school coming out of high school, but now he's kind of in the conversation in the draft, and he's sitting there waiting on a team to potentially draft him in this next couple of days. So I think that's really the big mission, is to get this quality information to coaches and athletes who do not have access to it, because honestly, that is what they deserve, and that's really what I'm all about.
That's awesome. Mark?
Okay, Brian, we're going to wrap up here. Can you let the listeners know how folks can get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. The best way to get in touch is through the website, www.thundersportsfitness.com. When you go on the website and the homepage, it talks about what my mission is and kind of where I'm at in the process. And there's social icons up at the top of the page if you want to see the YouTube channel, or see what I'm doing on Facebook or LinkedIn, or if you want to just send me an email, feel free to do that. And I'd love to open up a dialogue with any coach or athlete out there that's looking for this information. And that's what I'm trying to do right now is get the brand name out there and start showing people what I'm about and how I can bring some value to their program.
Excellent. Once again, we want to thank Brian Reynolds, strength and conditioning coach, owner at Thunder Sports and Fitness, for joining us here on session number 6 of the Tackling College Sports podcast. And remember, if you want to get in touch with us, we're on the gram at TCS Nation, Facebook at facebook.com/Tackling College Sports, Twitter at TCS Nation, online at tcsnation.com. And until next time, be your best.
Be your best.
Your college sports future awaits. So join the TCS Nation and be your best.